Hi, One Lit Teacher here. Today I'm going to talk about one of John Donne's most famous holy sonnets. This is Holy Sonnet 10, Death Be Not Proud. The opening line of this sonnet is often alluded to. In fact, there's a famous memoir by John Gunther called Death Be Not Proud, in which Gunther talks about the strength and grace of his dying teenage son who succumbed to cancer. But the opening line is often alluded to in other works as well. The poem is an apostrophe written directly to death, and we can perhaps see that in the opening line, which leads me to the idea that the punctuation in the poem is particularly important for understanding Donne's aim here and really getting the message. So while I don't normally take the time to read the poems out loud on my videos, this is a short one, 14 lines, and I'm going to do that so that we can really digest the message. Death, be not proud, though some have called thee mighty and dreadful, for thou art not so. For those whom thou thinkest thou dost o'erthrow die not, poor death, nor yet canst thou kill me. From rest and sleep, which but thy pictures be, much pleasure, then from thee much more must flow, and soonest our best men with thee do go, rest of their bones, and soul's delivery. Thou art slave to fate, chance, kings, and desperate men, and dost with poison, war, and sickness dwell, and poppier charms can make us sleep as well, and better than thy stroke, why swellest thou then? One short sleep past, we wake eternally, and death shall be no more. Death, thou shalt die. So again, the punctuation here is really important to understanding the message. Donne is saying, while even the most powerful men cannot escape death, death shouldn't be thought of as so mighty and dreadful because it's just a stop along the way, a rest, a little sleep before waking eternally into a Christian afterlife. And Donne is very confident in that message in this poem. This is a Petrarchan sonnet. It's a 14-line poem written in iambic pentameter, and the rhyme scheme has the very typical standard Petrarchan octave. That is the opening 8 lines, which are always the same in a Petrarchan sonnet, A-B-B-A, A-B-B-A. The sestet will vary in a Petrarchan sonnet. In this case, it is C-D-D-C-E-E. So this is octave sestet. But if you look really carefully at the punctuation again, you may also see it as quatrain, 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 couplet. If you're interested in the different types of sonnets, you might check out my video on the sonnet tradition on my YouTube channel, One Lit Teacher. This Petrarchan sonnet is a highly biographical poem, as Donne's other poems are. So the speaker is Donne himself, and this is written during a time of religious wrestling. It was written between 1609 and 1610, during a time period in his life where Donne returned to his religious thoughts more so than his earlier rakish ideas or the love theme that he wrote during the more mature love poem period when he wrote to his wife. Here he actually has to make a huge decision in his life, and he does. He becomes an Anglican minister, which is a big deal because Donne was a staunch Catholic, and his family was a long line of Catholic martyrs. So he converted during this time and became a very important religious figure in England. During the writing of this poem, he's really contemplating, again, the power of death and how his faith helps him to see it as not so mighty and not so dreadful. So the tone is defiant and challenging, and the theme is that death is really not powerful or permanent because we wake to an eternal afterlife in heaven. As all of John Donne's poems, this one has some important metaphysical qualities. And the most prominent are, of course, its argumentative tone and argumentative strategies. So Donne was, of course, a lawyer, and he uses some of those law strategies here, which are typical rhetorical strategies that are used in many metaphysical poems. The presence of death in the poem is also a metaphysical one. Donne is taking this abstract idea and giving it an embodiment, and he writes the poem directly to death in an extended apostrophe as if death were an entity that could hear, listen, and understand. It also focuses on the metaphysical view of afterlife, the Christian idea of afterlife in heaven, and the idea that the soul and the body are separated and the soul will live on after the demise of the body. And of course, that is also an idea that we can look at as the Platonic view of the soul as well, that separation. Here I have begun the color marking. Well, no colors here, but you can see the structural elements, which I like to mark with a pencil in case I make a mistake. Again, the poem has that octave, which is the ABBA, the standard Petrarchan beginning, and then the sestet, which in this case is CDDCEE. I have marked the I rhyme at the end so that you can see that eternally and die, they are not a perfect rhyme or an ear rhyme, but they go together making a new sound, that long I like die, rather than the long E as in thee, me, be, delivery in the octave. So a little bit of poetic license here with the rhyme. And the meter, again, is that standard iambic pentameter. I didn't even bother to mark it all the way through. The octave is very strictly iambic pentameter, but there are a few lines in the sestet where you might need to just take a close look to see what Donne is doing with the meter. So, for example, in line 9, there is a tie. If this were music, we would just blend one note into the next with a tie. Thou art slave to fate, chance, kings, and desperate men. And then 2 lines later, and pop your charms can make us sleep as well. Dee-dum, 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 dee-dum. So the use of that apostrophe, it's not an elision here, but a slur rather. And again, poetry and music are really one and the same. So think of it, if you're a musician, as a tie. My students often grapple with, how do you even come up with the overall theme or idea of the poem? And so I always recommend starting with repetition. It can also help you with the tone of the poem. So that's what I've done here. And I marked death as the most often repeated word in the poem. So it's clearly focused on death. I chose to mark the personal pronouns because they are repeated throughout: thee, thou, thy, thee, by circling them rather than underlining them. That they kind of help them jump out to me. And then I can see that this is an extended apostrophe written directly to death from the speaker, John Donne, directly. And there are some other elements that will help us to see that idea emerging in the poem. So, for example, death is personified. Donne is telling him, be not proud, even though some think you're mighty, and you think that you're overthrowing people and men go with you. You're really just a slave, and you dwell or live with some pretty seedy characters, and you will die. That's pointed out in that paradox in the final line. And so again, that helps us to see the poem as an apostrophe. The poem is highly argumentative, which is typical John Donne and also typical of all metaphysical poetry. Of course, Donne was trained as a lawyer. And so I just started out with those kind of argumentative, angry phrases and words like be not so, for, nor yet, shall be no more. And then I see there's also a rhetorical question there in the sestet: why swellest thou then? Again, rhetorical question is a very typical rhetorical strategy. And the poem ends with a very famous paradox: death, thou shalt die. And that, of course, is another powerful rhetorical strategy. I expanded my color marking to try to see even more clearly what Donne's argument is here. The reason death should not be so full of himself is because he's not that powerful. He's just like a little bit of sleep. Rest and sleep. And even silly things like poppy and charms, maybe drugs you can get at the fair, they can make us sleep just as well as you can. Death is just a short sleep, and then we wake. So that helps to really remove the power from death and drive home the argument here. This is a metaphor. It's a very typical metaphor that death is sleep. Like Shakespeare's Hamlet says, to die, to sleep perchance to dream. But the difference here is that Donne, unlike Hamlet, sees no rub in it. He's saying, and after all, there's no problem there. You're just helping us along to that place where we wake to eternal life. And so that really removes all of the dread and the power that people assign to death. In fact, death dwells with some, like I said, shady characters. I've underlined some affliction and disease ideas here. He lives with poison, war, and sickness. And the line before that shows that he's actually a slave. And I believe this is where the Volta comes in. Not only you're not that powerful, but you're really just a slave to fate, chance, kings, and desperate men. And this is actually a little bit of a syndeton here, where those ideas are listed in close proximity with just a comma to separate them. And it also speeds the momentum of the poem. I think I add that asyndeton in a later slide. So there's a pun as well in the sestet in line 12, and better than thy stroke. So death's stroke is not so powerful, but stroke, of course, is another way by which people can meet death. There is some antithesis in the 13th line, one short sleep, we wake eternally. Again, putting those ideas that are opposite close together helps us to really see the power that we assign to death as false. And before I finish up with the poem, don't forget always to look for those sound devices, which also will help us with the tone of the poem. Notably, there is some alliteration in the poem, but I believe the most important alliteration is the final line. Of course, throughout we have the sound with though, thee, thou, and so on, and the d, die, death. Before the octave is over, much more must flow is sort of this lulling sound that shows us that death really isn't that fantastic. And then in the final line, death, death, die, sort of drives home the message. There is some assonance as well, no more, but not nearly as important. And the anaphora, of course, is also a literary device, and poppy or charms. Oh, I'm sorry, and dost, and poppy or charms, and better, and death, which again just sort of helps with the momentum and helps us to see that Donne is sort of taking the power position in the poem over death. So, Death Be Not Proud is a very important holy sonnet in which John Donne strips away a personified death of his power. He takes that power from death and very firmly says that we have nothing to worry about with death. If you've enjoyed this presentation, then I hope that you will subscribe to my YouTube channel, One Lit Teacher, for other presentations on the poetry of John Donne, the sonnets of Shakespeare, and other pieces of literature. Thank you.